Bonding is when two or more elements come together to form a bond. The number of positive valence electrons must be equal to the number of negative valence electrons. The number of valence electrons is above the periodic table. Anything less than 4 is a positive element. Anything above 4 is a negative element. Elements with 4 or 8 valence electrons are balanced. Ionic bonds is when two elements come together to form a bond. Ionic compounds consist of a metal and a nonmetal. In an ionic compound, the number of positive and negative valence electrons must be equal. If valence electrons are not equal, you can add subscripts to each element to equal them up. The number of valence electrons are above each group in the periodic table. Blue circle numbers are positively charged elements. Green circle numbers are negatively charged elements. Pink circled is neutral charged elements. An example is calcium, which has two positively charged valence electrons. Oxygen has two negatively charged valence electrons. So together they'll make CaO, which is calcium oxide.
When naming ionic bonds, you have to identify the two elements. Once you do that, write the names of the two elements. After you do that, determine if you add the suffix "ide" or "oxide." An example is that the bond Kf. The elements on the table is K and F. K is potassium, F is fluorine. Together it's potassium fluorine. After you add the suffix "ide" to fluorine, which makes it potassium fluoride. Transition metals can have up to 4 charges. You can determine the charge amount once you've found the nonmetal. Transition metals can be found in the periodic table. The orange square is where the transition metals are located. When writing the amount of electrons, use Roman numerals. An example is nickel fluoride. Fluorine has a total of 2 negative valence electrons. Nickel must have 2 positive to balance the positive and negative.
Polyatomic ions are ionic bonds whose charge doesn't equal 0. You can spot a polyatomic when it has an 8 or onium suffix. Some polyatomics are ammonium, which is NH4, nitrate, which is NO3, acetate, which is C2H3O2, chlorate, which is ClO3, hydroxide, which is OH, carbonate, which is CO3, sulfate, which is SO4, and lastly phosphate, which is PO4.
To rewrite magnesium nitride into its molecule formula, you must identify the two elements, then determine the number of valence electrons. After you determine the difference in charges, lastly, you add a correct amount of elements until it's balanced. The numbers being added in pink are the charges of each element.
The first step in naming the bond BaCl2 is identifying each element. Ba is barium and Cl is chlorine. Next, you write the names of each element. Lastly, add the suffix oxide or "ide" to the nonmetal. The answer is barium chloride. To write mercury and bromide in its molecular formula, you first have to find mercury and bromine on the periodic table. Then find the number of valence electrons bromine has. After, you add an extra bromine because mercury has 2 positive valence electrons. The answer is HgBr2.